Close your eyes and imagine standing on a low, bare shore 430 million years ago. The rock beneath your feet is gray and empty, worn smooth by the tides, without a blade of grass or the shade of a single tree, for there are no trees anywhere in the world and there is almost nothing green upon the land at all. Behind you, the continent stretches away in silence, a wide expanse of stone and sand and drifting dust, quiet under a pale sun. There are no birds calling. There are no insects humming. There is no sound of life on the land behind you, only the wind moving across the barren rock and the soft, endless rhythm of the waves. But turn away from that empty land and look at the water, because the water is where the world is alive. In front of you, a warm, shallow sea stretches to the horizon, its surface catching the light, and beneath that surface lies a world teeming with life so rich and so strange that it would take you a lifetime to name it all. There are reefs down there, great mounds of living stone rising from the seafloor, crowded with creatures. There are forests of feathery sea lilies swaying in the current. There are armored things scuttling across the bottom, and shelled things by the countless million, and hunters gliding through the green water. And somewhere out in the shallows, a great shadow moves, long and armored and many-legged, a giant sea scorpion cruising through the warm water, one of the fiercest predators the sea has yet produced. This is the Silurian, one of the most important and least remembered chapters in the entire history of life. And it is a story of triumph, though a quiet one. Because not long before this warm and teeming sea existed, the oceans of the world had been very nearly emptied. A great catastrophe had swept through them, one of the worst in all of Earth's history, and life in the sea had been devastated, cut down, brought to the edge of ruin. And yet here, only a little while later in the vast reckoning of geological time, the sea is full again, fuller and richer and more complex than ever before. This is the age in which life did not merely survive but recovered and rebuilt, and finally, completely, conquered the water. And having conquered the water, it would soon do something even more extraordinary. It would begin to leave it. Tonight, we are going to travel back to the Silurian seas and drift through their warm and crowded waters, and witness the moment when life took full possession of the ocean. We will glide over the great reefs. We will meet the giant sea scorpions that ruled the shallows. We will witness the arrival of one of the most important innovations in the history of animals, the jaw, and watch the first true fish begin their long rise toward dominance. And in the end, we will follow a few small, stubborn pioneers as they creep out of the water and onto the empty land, taking the first tentative steps in the conquest of a whole new world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet comfort to see who is joining me from around the world, listening in the dark. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, something like the sound of warm, shallow waves rolling over a shore that has been gone for 400 million years. Find your comfortable position. Take a slow, deep breath, and let all the weight of the day drain gently away. And let us slip back through time into the warm and living seas of the Silurian. To understand the triumph of the Silurian, you first have to understand the catastrophe that came before it. Because the Silurian did not begin in abundance. It began in the aftermath of one of the greatest disasters in the history of life, and its story is, at its heart, a story of recovery from near annihilation. The period just before the Silurian was called the Ordovician, and it had been a time of astonishing richness in the seas, when life had diversified into a great profusion of forms. But it ended in horror. Around 445 million years ago, the world plunged into a severe ice age. The great southern supercontinent, a vast landmass that scientists call Gondwana, had drifted over the South Pole, and upon it grew enormous sheets of ice. As the ice spread, it locked away huge quantities of the world's water, and sea levels fell dramatically all across the globe. The warm, shallow seas that had cradled so much life drained away, and the creatures that depended on them died in vast numbers. Then, after a time, the ice melted, and the seas rushed back, and the sudden changes in temperature and sea level and ocean chemistry struck the survivors a second blow. Between these convulsions, an enormous fraction of all living species was wiped out, in one of the 5 greatest mass extinctions the planet has ever suffered. This was the world the Silurian inherited. A world scarred by ice and flood, its seas diminished, its life cut down. If you could have looked into the oceans in the immediate aftermath, you might have thought that the great pageant of marine life had been permanently impoverished, that the richness of the past was gone for good. But life is more stubborn than any catastrophe, and the sea did not stay empty. As the Silurian began, the world was warming again. The ice sheets on Gondwana were melting away. The climate was shifting back toward the warm greenhouse conditions in which life thrives. And as the ice melted, the seas rose once more, flooding across the low edges of the continents, spreading warm and shallow across vast areas of the world. And into those warm, rising, sunlit seas, life poured back, recovering, rebuilding, and beginning the long process of conquering the water more completely than ever before. To picture the Silurian world, you must again unlearn the map. The continents were scattered, and they were not where they are now. Gondwana still sprawled across the southern half of the globe, slowly drifting away from the pole as the ice retreated. In the tropics and toward the north lay several smaller continents. There was one that scientists call Laurentia, which contained much of what would become North America. There was Baltica, which held the core of northern Europe. And there was a smaller landmass called Avalonia, drifting through the seas. And here is one of the great dramas of the Silurian world, playing out across millions of years, too slow for any creature to perceive. These continents were converging. The ocean between them, a sea called the Iapetus Ocean, was slowly closing, narrowing as Laurentia and Baltica and Avalonia drifted toward one another. In time, they would collide, and their collision would crumple the crust and raise great mountain ranges, in a mountain-building event whose roots can still be traced in the ancient rocks of Scotland, Scandinavia, and eastern North America today. But the important thing, the thing that mattered for life, was the water. Because the convergence of these continents and the high sea levels of the warming world created vast expanses of warm, shallow, tropical sea. Shallow shelves spread across the flooded edges of the continents, and warm seaways ran between them, and these sunlit shallows became the cradle of the recovering, conquering life of the Silurian. This was a warm world, a greenhouse world, with little or no permanent ice, and its seas ran high and warm and clear, bathed in sunlight, rich with the nutrients that feed the base of the food web. It was, in short, an almost perfect environment for life to flourish, and flourish it did. And how do we know all this, across such an immense gulf of time? The rocks of the Silurian are found all over the world, and they are rich with fossils. And among the most useful of them are strange, small, delicate creatures called graptolites, which we will meet properly later in our journey. These little colonial animals drifted through the Silurian seas in enormous numbers, and because they evolved rapidly and spread everywhere, their fossils allow geologists to date and correlate the rock layers of the Silurian with remarkable precision, dividing the period into fine slices of time. From the graptolites, and from the corals and the shells and the fish and all the other fossils preserved in the ancient rock, we have reassembled the story of the Silurian seas, though never completely. For the fossil record is always partial, and much of what we say must remain, as the title of our journey admits, only as we understand it. But what we understand is a story of extraordinary recovery and triumph. So let us go down into those warm, shallow seas and see how life took possession of the water. Before we meet the creatures of the Silurian, it is worth pausing to understand why these particular seas were so well suited to the flourishing of life, why this was the age in which the water was so completely conquered. Because the Silurian seas had a particular character, a set of conditions that made them one of the great cradles of life in the history of the planet. The first and most important thing about the Silurian seas was that they were shallow. This may seem like a small detail, but it is everything. Because of the high sea levels of the warming world, the oceans had spread out across the low, flat edges of the continents, flooding vast areas of land beneath shallow water. These were not the deep, dark, open oceans, but broad, sunlit shelves, where the water might be only tens of meters deep across enormous stretches, and where the sunlight reached all the way down to the seafloor. And where sunlight reaches the bottom, life can flourish at every level, from the tiny drifting plants near the surface to the creatures rooted on the floor below. The shallow, sunlit shelf seas of the Silurian were bathed in light from top to bottom, and light in the ocean is the source of nearly all life. The second thing about these seas was that they were warm. The Silurian was a greenhouse world, and its shallow tropical seas were warm and gentle, free of the killing cold that had devastated life during the ice age of the late Ordovician. Warmth speeds the processes of life, encourages growth and reproduction and diversity. And in the warm, shallow seas of the Silurian, life could grow abundant and complex, building reefs, filling the water with creatures, spreading into every available niche. The third thing was that these seas were rich. The shallow shelves were fed by nutrients, and the warm sunlit water encouraged the growth of the tiny organisms at the base of the food web. And where the base of the food web is rich, everything above it can flourish too. The abundance at the bottom of the food chain fed an abundance of small creatures, which fed an abundance of larger ones, which fed the predators at the top. The whole system was supercharged by the richness of these warm, shallow seas. And so, across the Silurian, life did something remarkable. It filled the water. Not just parts of it, not just the bottom or the surface, but the whole of it, every level, every zone, every roll. On the seafloor, reefs rose and crinoid gardens swayed and shelled creatures grazed by the million. In the water above, cephalopods cruised and fish began to rise. Drifting through the open water were the graptolites and the plankton. Scuttling across the bottom were the trilobites, and hunting through the shallows were the great sea scorpions. By the Silurian, life had achieved something it had been building toward for a very long time. It had taken full possession of the sea, colonizing every part of it, filling the warm, shallow water with a richness and complexity that rivaled or exceeded anything that had come before. This is what it means to say that in the Silurian, life conquered the water. It did not merely live in the sea. It ruled it completely at every level. And there is a deep significance to this completeness, one that reaches forward into the rest of the history of life. Because once life had so thoroughly filled the sea, once every niche was occupied and the competition for space and food had grown so intense, there began to be pressure to look elsewhere, to find new places to live, new opportunities beyond the crowded and dangerous water. And beyond the water lay the land, empty and barren and full of promise. The complete conquest of the sea was, in a sense, the thing that eventually drove life out of it. But that is a story for later in our journey. For now, There is one more thing to understand about these seas before we descend into them, and it has to do with the very air and chemistry of the ancient world, with the forces that made the warm, shallow Silurian waters such a perfect cradle for the flourishing of life. We have spoken of the Silurian seas as warm and shallow and rich, and these things are true, but behind them lie deeper forces, the great planetary cycles of climate and chemistry and atmosphere that shaped the conditions of life in those ancient waters. To truly understand why the Silurian was such a cradle of life, we have to look beyond the water itself, to the air above it and the slow chemistry within it, to the very breath of the ancient world. The Silurian was, as we have seen, a warm age, a greenhouse world with little or no permanent ice. This warmth was driven in large part by the composition of the atmosphere, and in particular by the amount of carbon dioxide it contained. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, a gas that traps heat, and in the Silurian the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were, as we understand it, considerably higher than they are in the world today, many times higher by some estimates. This abundance of carbon dioxide wrapped the planet in a thick blanket of warmth, keeping the world hot, melting away the ice that had gripped the poles during the catastrophe of the late Ordovician, and maintaining the warm conditions in which life could flourish. The greenhouse warmth of the Silurian was, in a sense, written into the very air, into the high levels of carbon dioxide that held the heat close to the planet. And there was another gas whose story matters greatly for the life of the Silurian, and that is oxygen. The oxygen in the atmosphere and dissolved in the seas is essential for the life of nearly all complex animals, for it is the fuel that powers their bodies, and the amount of it available shapes what kinds of life can exist and how active and how large they can be. Across the long history of the Earth, the levels of oxygen have risen and fallen, and by the Silurian, oxygen had reached levels sufficient to support a rich and active animal life in the seas, sufficient to fuel the fierce metabolisms of the great sea scorpions and the rising fish, and all the other creatures of the conquered water. The presence of abundant oxygen in the Silurian seas was one of the quiet enabling conditions of the whole flourishing of life, an invisible foundation on which everything else was built. But the levels of oxygen in the ancient seas were not perfectly stable, and here we touch on one of the ongoing dramas of the Silurian world. From time to time, the chemistry of the oceans shifted, and the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water changed, sometimes falling in certain regions or at certain depths, creating stretches of water that were low in oxygen or even entirely without it. Such low oxygen conditions could be deadly to the creatures of the sea, and they appear to have played a role in the periodic disturbances and minor extinction events that punctuated the Silurian, times when the shifting chemistry of the oceans stressed and struck down parts of the living world. The seas of the Silurian were rich and flourishing, but they were also dynamic, subject to the slow swings of ocean chemistry, to changes in oxygen and carbon and temperature that could, from time to time, turn the cradle of life into a place of stress and death. Even in this age of triumph, the living world remained at the mercy of the great planetary cycles. And these cycles were connected, in the Silurian, to something new and momentous that was beginning to happen at the edge of the water, something we will explore more fully later in our journey. Because as the first plants began to colonize the land, they began, ever so slightly, to change the chemistry of the whole planet. Plants draw carbon dioxide from the air and release oxygen, and as the first land plants spread across the damp margins of the Silurian world, they began to participate in the great cycles of carbon and oxygen, beginning a transformation that would, over the ages to come, reshape the atmosphere entirely. The greening of the land, which began in the Silurian, was not just a change on the land itself. It was the beginning of a change in the very breath of the planet, in the balance of the gases that shaped the climate and the seas. Life was beginning, for the first time, to remake the world on a global scale. So when you picture the warm, shallow seas of the Silurian, picture also the ancient air above them, thick with carbon dioxide, holding the world in greenhouse warmth. Picture the oxygen dissolved in the water, fueling the fierce life of the conquered sea. And picture the slow, vast cycles of chemistry and climate that shaped it all, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, the great planetary rhythms within which the whole drama of Silurian life unfolded. These were the deep conditions of the Silurian world, the breath of the ancient planet, and they made possible everything that lived in those warm and teeming seas. And now, at last, let us descend into that water and explore the conquered sea, beginning with its most magnificent structures, the great reefs that rose from the Silurian seafloor. Among the greatest achievements of Silurian life, the clearest sign that the sea had been not merely repopulated but truly conquered, were the reefs. Because after the devastation of the late Ordovician, when so much of the reef-building life of the world had been swept away, the reefs came back in the Silurian, larger and grander than before, building some of the first truly great reef ecosystems in the history of the planet. To descend into a Silurian shallows and float above one of these reefs would have been to witness one of the most vibrant and crowded scenes life had yet produced. The Silurian reef, like the reefs of every age, was built by living things laying down stone, but the architects of the Silurian reef were not the corals you would recognize from a modern tropical sea. They were more ancient kinds. A great part of the reef was built by creatures called stromatoporoids, a now-vanished group of sponges that grew in dense, layered mounds, laying down calcium carbonate in fine sheets, generation after generation, until their skeletons fused into the solid framework of the reef. Some grew flat like tables, some rounded like boulders, some rose in great heads, and together they formed the bulk of the reef structure, the foundation on which everything else depended. Alongside them grew the corals, but ancient kinds, unfamiliar kinds. There were the tabulate corals, which built honeycomb-like colonies in chains and delicate organ-pipe structures, laying down their stony skeletons in intricate patterns. And there were the rugose corals, sometimes called horn corals, solitary creatures that grew in curving, cone-shaped cups, each one a single animal sitting in its own carved goblet of stone. Together, the stromatoporoids and the tabulate and rugose corals wove a reef of extraordinary complexity, a labyrinth of ledges and caves and overhangs, sheltering an immense diversity of life. And the life the reef sheltered was abundant beyond easy imagining. The reef and the seafloor around it were carpeted with creatures. There were brachiopods, small shelled animals that filtered food from the water, so numerous that their shells would one day form great beds of limestone. There were bryozoans, tiny colonial creatures that built delicate, lace-like structures across the reef. There were fields of crinoids, the sea lilies, animals related to starfish that grew on long, flexible stalks anchored to the bottom, their feathery arms combing the water for food, swaying in the current like meadows of strange flowers. From a distance, a crinoid garden would have looked almost like a field of grass rippling in the wind, except that every stem was an animal, patiently filtering the water. There were snails and clams and trilobites scuttling through the crevices, and the whole reef hummed with the slow, dense, endless business of life. You can still visit the ruins of these Silurian reefs today, if you know where to look. In parts of England, There are famous beds of limestone laid down by Silurian reefs, packed with the fossils of that ancient world, so rich that they became celebrated among the earliest fossil collectors. In the rocks of Sweden and North America and many other places, the Silurian reefs remain, lifted up and turned to stone, silent monuments to an age when life first learned to build reefs on such a grand scale after the Great Catastrophe. You can hold a piece of Silurian reef limestone and see, embedded within it, the corals and the shells, and the fragments of creatures that lived and died on a reef 400 million years ago, in a warm, shallow sea that has long since vanished from the earth. The return and flourishing of the reefs is one of the clearest signs of the Silurian triumph. Reefs are among the richest and most complex ecosystems that life can build, and they require stability and warmth and abundant life and time. That the reefs came back so strongly in the Silurian after the devastation that had come before tells us that life had not merely survived the catastrophe but had recovered fully, had rebuilt the most complex of marine ecosystems, had taken possession of the seafloor and made of it a crowded, thriving, magnificent world. The reef was the sea conquered, made into a living city of stone. And around and above that city moved the other creatures of the Silurian sea, the shelled multitudes, the scuttling trilobites, and the great hunters that fed upon them all. Beyond and around the reefs, across the wide, sunlit floors of the Silurian shallows, lived the great multitudes of the sea, the countless shelled and armored creatures that formed the crowded, teeming base of the living world. These were not the fearsome hunters, and they were not the grand reef builders, but they were the abundance that made everything else possible, the vast populations of grazers and filterers upon which the whole food web ultimately rested. The most numerous of all were the brachiopods. To a casual eye, a brachiopod looks something like a clam, a small creature living inside a two-part hinged shell. But brachiopods are built on an entirely different plan from clams, and they are far more ancient, and in the Silurian they were among the most successful and abundant animals in the sea. They lived anchored to the seafloor or nestled in the sediment, opening their shells to filter tiny particles of food from the water, and they existed in enormous variety and staggering numbers. Whole stretches of the Silurian seafloor were carpeted with brachiopods, their shells packed together by the million, filtering the warm water, quietly forming the living foundation of the sea. Their fossils are so abundant in Silurian rocks that in many places they are the most common fossils of all, a testament to just how thoroughly these small shelled creatures had colonized the ancient seafloor. Among the brachiopods and across the reef scuttled the trilobites, those iconic armored arthropods that are, for many people, the very symbol of ancient sea life. The trilobites had first appeared long before the Silurian, and they had already ruled the seas for well over 100 million years. But by the Silurian, their great age was beginning to wane. They had suffered in the extinctions, and they would never again reach the dizzying diversity of their early heyday. And yet they were still there, still abundant, still an important part of the Silurian Sea, crawling across the seafloor and through the reef on their many legs, their bodies protected by segmented armor of calcite, their eyes, in many species, remarkably sophisticated. The eyes of the trilobites deserve a moment of wonder, for they were among the first sophisticated eyes in the history of life, and they were unlike any eyes that exist today. A trilobite's eye was made not of soft tissue, but of crystal, of tiny lenses of the mineral calcite, arranged in intricate arrays across the surface of the eye. Each lens gathered light and focused it, and together they gave the trilobite a compound view of its world, allowing it to see the shapes and movements of the warm, sunlit sea around it. These crystal eyes have been preserved in the fossils, so that we can look today at the very lenses through which a trilobite gazed out at the Silurian Sea 400 million years ago. A strange and beautiful connection across an unimaginable span of time. The Silurian trilobites came in many forms. Some were smooth and streamlined, built for crawling and burrowing. Some bore spines and ridges and elaborate ornament. Some had large, prominent eyes raised on stalks or turrets, giving them a wide view of the seafloor around them, all the better to spot the approach of a predator. For the trilobites, by the Silurian, were increasingly the hunted rather than the hunters. The great predators of the sea scorpions and the rising fish, fed upon them, and the trilobites had to defend themselves as best they could with their armor, with their spines, and with the ancient trick of rolling themselves up into a tight, protected ball, tucking their soft undersides safely inside their armored shells, a defense that trilobites had been using for a very long time and that we can see, frozen mid-curl, in countless fossils. The shelled multitudes and the scuttling trilobites were the abundance of the Silurian Sea, the vast crowd of grazers and filterers that filled the seafloor and fed the world above them. They were the reason the sea could support its great predators, the living fuel that powered the whole system. And they lived, as such creatures always do, under the constant shadow of the hunters. For gliding through the warm shallows above them and hunting across the seafloor among them were the fiercest predators the Silurian Sea had yet produced, the great sea scorpions, the terrors of the ancient shallows. Let us meet them now. Among all the creatures of the Silurian seas, none were more fearsome, and none more strange to our eyes than the sea scorpions. These were the Eurypterids, a group of large predatory arthropods, and in the Silurian they reached the peak of their power and diversity, ruling the warm, shallow seas as some of the most formidable hunters of their age. To meet one in the ancient water would have been to confront a monster unlike anything alive today, a great armored creature, long and segmented and many-limbed, gliding through the shallows on the hunt. The Eurypterids were arthropods, related to the arachnids and the horseshoe crabs, and in a broad sense they were kin to the scorpions of the land, which is how they earned their common name. But they lived in the water, and some of them grew far larger than any scorpion that has ever crawled on land. Their bodies were long and segmented, protected by tough armor, and they moved through the water using paddle-like limbs at the rear of the body, which drove them forward with powerful strokes. At the front, many of them bore grasping appendages, arms tipped with claws or spines, for seizing and holding their prey, and they had keen eyes, set on the front of the head, for hunting in the warm, sunlit water. The most common of the Silurian sea scorpions was a creature called Eurypterus, so abundant and so well preserved in the rocks of what is now New York State that it has become the official fossil of that region, known from thousands upon thousands of specimens. Eurypterus was not the largest of its kind, reaching perhaps a little under a meter in length, but it was a capable and successful predator, hunting through the shallow seas and the tidal margins, seizing smaller creatures with its grasping limbs. It lived in great numbers, and its abundant fossils give us one of our clearest windows into the life of the Silurian sea scorpions. But some of the Eurypterids grew far larger, into true giants of the ancient sea. There was a group of them called the Turrigodids, and they were among the largest arthropods that have ever existed. A creature such as Turrigodus could reach lengths well over 1.5 meters, a monstrous size for an arthropod, and it was armed with large, powerful claws at the front of its body, sturdy grasping appendages tipped with teeth-like structures, built for seizing and crushing and tearing its prey. These giant sea scorpions were apex predators of the Silurian shallows, hunting fish and trilobites and other creatures, and even one another. Imagine a predatory arthropod longer than you are tall, gliding through the warm green water on beating paddles, its great clawed arms extended before it, its eyes fixed on its prey. This was the terror of the Silurian Sea, and it ruled the shallows as few creatures ever have. The reign of the giant sea scorpions reached across the boundary of the Silurian and into the age that followed, and in the early part of the next period, the Devonian, the very largest of all, would appear, a creature that may have reached lengths of over 2 meters, the largest arthropod known ever to have lived. But the foundations of this reign of giant sea scorpions were laid in the Silurian, when the Eurypterids reached their peak of diversity and dominance, filling the warm, shallow seas with their armored, many-limbed, claw-wielding forms. They were the great predators of their age, the rulers of the conquered sea, at least for a time. But even as the sea scorpions ruled, something was rising beneath them that would, in the long run, displace them entirely and change the sea forever. Because in the same warm, shallow waters where the Eurypterids hunted, a new kind of creature was diversifying, a creature with a spine down its back and increasingly with something no animal had ever possessed in such a form before: a hinged mouth, a jaw. The fish were rising, and with them came the single most important innovation in the history of the animals of the sea. Let us turn now to the coming of the jaw. Of all the developments in the Silurian seas, of all the signs that life was conquering the water more completely than ever before, none would prove more consequential, more world-changing, than a single innovation that came fully into its own during this period. It was the jaw. It seems such a simple thing, a hinged mouth that can open and close, seize and bite and cut. You have one. You are using it in a sense even as you rest and breathe. But the jaw was one of the most important inventions in the entire history of animal life, and its rise in the Silurian seas would set the course for everything that followed, including, eventually, you. To understand why the jaw mattered so much, you have to understand what came before it. For a very long time since the first fish had appeared in the ancient seas, the backboned animals had been jawless. They were creatures with a simple, round or slot-like opening at the front of the body, unable to bite or seize or chew. They fed by sucking and filtering and rasping, taking in small particles of food or grubbing through the sediment or straining the water. They were limited, in a fundamental way, by their mouths. Without a jaw, a fish could not seize large prey, could not bite off pieces of something bigger than itself, could not become an active hunter of other sizable animals. The jawless fish had their place in the sea and they were abundant, but they were constrained forever by the simplicity of their mouths. And then, across the ages leading into and through the Silurian, something changed. In the lineage of the fish, the structures that supported the gills, the bony or cartilaginous arches that held open the gill slits, began to be modified. As we understand it, the front pair of these gill-supporting arches, over immense spans of evolutionary time, became repurposed, reshaped into a new structure entirely. They became hinged. They became a mouth that could open and close with force. They became jaws. It was one of those profound evolutionary transformations in which an existing structure, built for one purpose, is gradually made over into something new and revolutionary. The gill arch became the jaw, and with the jaw, the whole world of the fish and eventually the whole world of the vertebrates was transformed. Consider what the jaw made possible. With a jaw, a fish could seize prey and hold it fast. It could bite, tearing off pieces of food larger than it could swallow whole. It could crush shells and armor. It could become, for the first time among the backboned animals, a true active predator, a hunter of other sizable creatures. The jaw opened up entire new ways of living, new sources of food, new roles in the ecosystem. It set off a new phase in the ancient arms race, because now the vertebrates could hunt one another, and prey could be seized in a way that had never been possible before. The evolution of the jaw was, in a very real sense, the moment when the backboned animals began their long climb toward dominance of the seas, and eventually of the land, and eventually of the whole living world. The jawed fish, the gnathostomes, as scientists call them, first appeared before the Silurian, but it was during the Silurian that they truly began to diversify and establish themselves, spreading through the warm, shallow seas, taking up new ways of life, laying the foundations for the great flowering of fish that would come in the following period. The Silurian was the dawn of the age of jaws, the beginning of the vertebrate conquest of the sea, and it was one of the quiet turning points in the history of all life. From these first jawed fish, swimming in the warm Silurian shallows, would descend the sharks, the bony fish, and eventually the four-limbed animals that would crawl onto the land, and eventually the mammals, and eventually us. The jaw you use to speak and eat is a modified fish gill arch, reshaped across 400 million years, its story reaching back into the warm seas of the Silurian. And now, let us meet the fish themselves, the creatures that carried this world-changing innovation into the conquered sea. In the warm, shallow seas of the Silurian, the fish were rising. They were not yet the rulers of the ocean, for that role still belonged to the great sea scorpions and other invertebrate hunters. But they were diversifying, spreading, experimenting with new forms and new ways of life, and they were laying the foundation for a takeover that would, in the ages to come, make the fish the dominant vertebrates of the sea. The Silurian was the dawn of the age of fishes, and to understand it, we have to meet the strange and varied creatures that swam through those ancient waters. There were still, in the Silurian, great numbers of the old jawless fish, the creatures that had ruled the vertebrate world before the coming of the jaw. Many of these were the ostracoderms, a name that means shell-skinned, and they were jawless fish encased in bony armor, their heads sheathed in solid shields of bone, their bodies often covered in scales. They came in wonderfully strange shapes, some with heads like broad, flat shovels, some with horns and wings of bone flaring out from their shields. They were not strong swimmers, and they lived mostly near the bottom, in the shallows and the estuaries and the rivers, grubbing and filtering and sucking, going about the ancient jawless way of life. They were the old guard, the last great flourishing of a design that stretched back to the very beginnings of vertebrate life, and in the Silurian they were still abundant, still successful, even as the jawed fish rose around them. But it was the jawed fish, the newcomers, who represented the future. Among the earliest and most important of them were the acanthodians, sometimes called the spiny sharks, though they were not true sharks. These were small, streamlined fish, and their most distinctive feature was a set of stout spines that supported their fins, giving them a bristling, well-defended appearance. The acanthodians were among the first jawed fish to become abundant and diverse, and in the Silurian they spread through the seas, active swimmers with their new hinged mouths, hunting small prey in the open water. They were, in a sense, among the pioneers of the jawed vertebrates, demonstrating the power of the new innovation, filling the water with fast-swimming, sharp-toothed, actively hunting fish. And there were the first hints of the great groups that would come to rule. The placoderms, the armored fish that would dominate the following period, were beginning to appear. And most significant of all for our own distant story, the earliest bony fish were arising in the Silurian seas. The bony fish, the group that would eventually include the vast majority of all fish species, as well as the lineage that would crawl onto land and give rise to all four-limbed animals, had its origins here. Among the oldest known bony fish is a creature from the late Silurian, found in the rocks of what is now China, a small fish that represents one of the earliest members of the great lineage that would one day lead to us. To look at such a creature is to look at the deep root of our own family tree, a small fish swimming in a warm Silurian sea, carrying within it the beginnings of everything the bony fish would become. The rise of the fish in the Silurian is one of the quietest and most important stories in the history of life. It did not happen suddenly, and it did not, in the Silurian itself, result in the fish taking over the sea. That would come later, in the age that followed. But the foundations were laid in the Silurian, when the jawed fish diversified and spread, when the acanthodians hunted the warm shallows, and the first bony fish appeared, when the vertebrates, armed with their new jaws, began the long climb that would eventually carry them to the top of the food chain and beyond, out of the water entirely and onto the land. The conquest of the sea by the vertebrates began in earnest in the Silurian, in the rise of the fish. But the fish were not the only hunters in that sea. Cruising through the warm water were older predators, and drifting through it were creatures stranger still. Let us continue our exploration of the conquered sea. While the sea scorpions ruled the shallows and the fish rose from the seafloor, the open water of the Silurian Sea was crossed by other hunters, creatures that swam and drifted through the sunlit water above the reefs and the crowded floor. To understand how completely life had conquered the sea, you have to look not only at the bottom and the shallows, but at the open water itself, the great volume of the sea between the surface and the floor, for it too was full of life, full of hunters and drifters and swimmers of many kinds. Among the most important of the open water hunters were the cephalopods, the ancient relatives of the modern squid and octopus and nautilus. In the Silurian seas, the dominant cephalopods were the nautiloids, creatures that lived inside chambered shells, extending their tentacled bodies to swim and to hunt. Some of them had coiled shells like the modern nautilus, but many had long, straight, cone-shaped shells, and these are called orthocones. An orthocone cephalopod was a streamlined hunter, jetting through the water by squirting water from its body, its tentacles trailing before it, its eyes watching for prey. In the ages before the Silurian, some orthocones had grown to enormous sizes, becoming among the largest predators in the sea. By the Silurian they were generally more modest, but they remained important hunters, cruising the open water, seizing smaller creatures with their tentacles and drawing them into their beaked mouths. To see one gliding through the warm green water, its long straight shell held level, its tentacles reaching, would have been to see one of the most active and intelligent predators of the ancient sea. The cephalopods were, in their way, among the most advanced creatures of the Silurian, for they had large eyes and active, swimming lifestyles, and, as their modern relatives suggest, considerable intelligence. They represented a very different approach to hunting than the armored sea scorpions or the rising fish, an approach based on jet propulsion and grasping tentacles and keen vision. And they filled a crucial role in the open water, adding yet another kind of hunter to a sea already thick with predators, helping to complete the conquest of every zone and niche of the ocean. Alongside the cephalopods, the open water held many other creatures. There were the ancestors and relatives of many modern groups, small swimming and drifting animals filling the water with life. There were early relatives of the fish and various invertebrates, and vast quantities of tiny organisms drifting in the plankton, the microscopic foundation of the whole food web. The open water of the Silurian was not empty. It was full, crossed by hunters and crowded with drifting life, colonized as thoroughly as the seafloor below. And there is one group of open water creatures so important, so characteristic of the Silurian, and so useful to the scientists who study it, that they deserve a chapter of their own. They were small and strange and colonial, drifting through the water in delicate branching forms, and they filled the Silurian seas in such numbers that their fossils have become one of the primary means by which we read the very time of the period. They were the graptolites, the drifters of the ancient sea, and to understand the Silurian and to understand how completely life had taken possession of even the open water, we must meet them now. Some of the most abundant and important creatures of the Silurian seas were also among the smallest and strangest, and they are little known outside the world of those who study ancient life. They were the graptolites, and they drifted through the open water of the Silurian in enormous numbers, filling the seas with their delicate colonial forms, and leaving behind a fossil record so rich and so finely detailed that it has become one of the master keys to reading the time of the ancient world. A graptolite was not a single animal but a colony, a collection of many tiny creatures living together in a shared structure. Each colony was built of a delicate framework, often shaped like a saw blade or a branching twig or a spiral or a network of fine threads, and along this framework lived the individual animals, each in its own tiny cup, filtering food from the water. The colony as a whole drifted through the open sea, or in some cases was anchored to the bottom or attached to floating objects, and it grew by adding new cups and new individuals, extending its delicate form through the water. The graptolites were related, as we understand it, to a group of creatures that still exists today in obscure and little-noticed forms. But in the Silurian they were among the dominant creatures of the open water, drifting through the seas in vast, uncountable multitudes. When graptolites died, their delicate colonies sank to the seafloor, and in the right conditions, particularly in the fine muds of quiet, deep, or oxygen-poor water, they were preserved as fossils, often flattened into thin films that look, on the surface of a piece of dark rock, like faint pencil marks, like tiny saw blades or feathers etched into the stone. Indeed, the name graptolite comes from words meaning written in stone, because the fossils resemble strange writing on the rock. And these fossils are extraordinarily useful to geologists, for a reason that makes them one of the great tools of the science. The graptolites evolved rapidly, changing their forms quickly across time, and they spread everywhere, drifting through the seas of the whole world. This means that a particular kind of graptolite lived only during a particular, often quite short, span of time, but lived in that span all across the globe. And so, when geologists find a particular graptolite in the rocks, they can know, with remarkable precision, the age of those rocks, and they can match rocks of the same age all over the world by the graptolites they contain. The graptolites divide the Silurian into fine slices of time, allowing scientists to read the sequence of the period with a precision that would otherwise be impossible. There is something wonderful in this, in the idea that these tiny, delicate, long-vanished colonial creatures, drifting through the ancient seas, have become the timekeepers of the Silurian, the means by which we read the very chapters of that distant age. Every faint pencil mark on a piece of dark Silurian shale is a colony of animals that lived and drifted and died 400 million years ago, and every one is also a marker of time, a signpost in the deep history of the Earth. The graptolites in life filled the open water of the Silurian Sea, colonizing it as thoroughly as the reefs colonized the floor, completing the conquest of every zone of the ocean. And in death, they became the writing on the rock by which we read that conquered sea's own history. With the graptolites drifting in the open water, the picture of the Silurian Sea is nearly complete. Life had taken possession of every part of it, the seafloor with its reefs and shelled multitudes and scuttling trilobites, the shallows with their great sea scorpions, the water column with its rising fish and cruising cephalopods, and the open sea with its drifting graptolites and its clouds of plankton. Every level, every zone, every role was filled. The water had been conquered. But before we step back and take in the whole of that living sea, it is worth pausing on a quieter truth, one that the very title of our journey admits, and that shapes everything we can say about this ancient world. It is the truth that we do not and cannot know the Silurian completely. Much of it is lost, and much of what we say must remain only as we understand it. Let us spend a little while, then, considering the shadows in the picture, the things the Silurian has not told us, and the extraordinary rare windows through which we glimpse what would otherwise be gone forever. For all that we have said about the Silurian seas, for all the reefs and sea scorpions and fish and drifters we have described, there is a great deal about that ancient world that we do not know and never will. And it is worth understanding why, because it reveals something important about how we come to know the deep past at all, and about the humility with which we must approach it. The Silurian, like every ancient age, comes to us only in fragments, and much of it lies forever in shadow. The reason for this is the nature of fossilization itself, which is a rare and fickle and deeply unfair process. When a creature dies, in almost every case, it simply vanishes. Its body is eaten by scavengers, or broken apart by the currents, or rotted away by decay until nothing remains. Only in unusual circumstances, when a body is buried quickly in the right kind of sediment under the right conditions, does it stand any chance of being preserved as a fossil. And even then, it is usually only the hard parts that survive, the shells and the bones and the armor and the teeth. The soft parts, the flesh and the organs and the delicate tissues, almost always rot away, leaving no trace. This means that our picture of the Silurian, like our picture of every ancient age, is enormously biased toward the creatures with hard, preservable parts, and enormously blind to the creatures that were soft. Think of what this means for the Silurian Sea. We have wonderful fossils of the shelled brachiopods, the armored trilobites, the stony corals, the hard-shelled cephalopods, the bony fish, the tough-bodied sea scorpions. But how many soft-bodied creatures lived in that sea and left no trace at all? How many kinds of worms and jellyfish and soft-bodied swimmers and delicate drifting things filled the Silurian water and vanished utterly, leaving not a single fossil behind? We can never know for certain, but it is likely that the soft-bodied creatures, the ones we cannot see, were as numerous and as important as the ones we can. Our picture of the Silurian Sea is like a photograph in which only the hard and durable things appear, while everything soft has faded to invisibility. The sea was fuller and stranger and more diverse than the fossils alone can ever show us. And yet, once in a very long while, the fossil record does something extraordinary. In a few rare places, under exceptional conditions, even the soft-bodied creatures were preserved, captured in fine detail by some quirk of chemistry and circumstance, so that we can glimpse, for a moment, the parts of the ancient world that are almost always invisible. Scientists call these rare and precious sites by a special name, and they are among the most treasured windows into the deep past. In such a place, the fine mud or the particular chemistry preserved not just the shells and the bones, but the soft bodies, the delicate tissues, the creatures that would otherwise have left no trace. A single such sight can transform our understanding of an entire age, revealing whole groups of creatures we would never otherwise have known existed. For the Silurian, there are a small number of these exceptional windows, sites where the soft-bodied life of the ancient sea has been preserved in remarkable detail. In certain deposits, scientists have found the delicate remains of creatures that would normally have vanished completely, soft-bodied animals, the fine details of their bodies, glimpses of the hidden diversity of the Silurian Sea. Each such discovery is like a sudden light thrown into a dark room, revealing, for a moment, how much more there was than the ordinary fossils show. And each one reminds us how much remains hidden, how much of the Silurian and of every ancient age lies forever beyond our reach, lost to the imperfection of the record, surviving, if at all, only in these rare and precious windows. This is why we say, again and again, that this is the Silurian as we understand it, and not the Silurian as it simply was. Because our understanding is built from fragments, from the durable remains that happen to be preserved, from the rare windows that happen to capture the soft and delicate, from the patient reconstruction of a world that is mostly lost. We know a great deal, more than you might think possible for a world 400 million years gone. But we do not know everything, and we never will, and there is a kind of quiet wonder in that. In the vast dark spaces of the deep past, in the creatures that lived and died in the Silurian Sea and left no trace, in the shadows that will always surround even our best picture of that ancient world. The Silurian Sea was fuller than we can ever fully see, alive with creatures we can only imagine, and that mystery is part of its beauty. Now, holding both what we know and what we cannot know, let us step back and take in the whole of that living sea. Let us pause now and float in the warm, shallow water of the Silurian, and take in the whole of the conquered sea at once, the full richness of a world that life had, after the great catastrophe, taken back and made more completely its own than ever before. Look down and you see the seafloor, and it is not bare. It is carpeted with life. There are the reefs, great mounds of stony coral and sponge, rising from the floor crowded with creatures, sheltering an immense diversity of life in their ledges and caves. There are the crinoid gardens, forests of feathery sea lilies on their long stalks, swaying in the current, filtering the water. There are the brachiopods by the countless million, their shells packed across the floor, quietly filtering, forming the abundant base of the living world. There are the trilobites, scuttling across the sediment and through the reef on their many legs, their crystal eyes watching, their armored bodies ready to roll into a protective ball at the first sign of danger. The floor of the Silurian Sea is a crowded, teeming, living city. Look up and around, into the warm, sunlit water above the floor, and it too is full of life. There are the fish, the jawless ostracoderms grubbing near the bottom and the rising-jawed fish, the spiny acanthodians hunting in the open water with their new hinged mouths, the first bony fish carrying the deep beginnings of our own lineage. There are the cephalopods, the nautiloids in their coiled and straight shells, jetting through the water, tentacles reaching, keen eyes watching for prey. And gliding through the shallows are the great sea scorpions, the eurypterids, the fierce armored hunters that ruled the Silurian shallows, some of them giants longer than a person is tall, cruising on beating paddles with their great claws extended. And drifting through the open water above it all are the graptolites, the delicate colonial creatures filling the sea in vast multitudes, and the clouds of tiny plankton, the microscopic foundation on which the whole living world rested. From the deepest reef to the sunlit surface, from the crowded floor to the open water, the Silurian Sea was full, colonized at every level, filled with life in every form and every role. And here is the thing to hold in your mind, the thing that makes this scene so significant. Not long before, this sea, or the seas of the world that preceded it, had been very nearly emptied. The great catastrophe of the late Ordovician had swept through the oceans and devastated their life, cutting down the diversity of the world, bringing the great pageant of marine life to the edge of ruin. And yet here, only a little while later in the vast reckoning of geological time, the sea was full again, fuller and richer than before, its reefs rebuilt, its waters teeming, its every zone conquered and colonized. Life had not merely survived the catastrophe. It had recovered and rebuilt and triumphed, taking possession of the water more completely than ever before in its history. This is what it means to say that in the Silurian, life conquered the water. It filled the sea completely at every level, in defiance of the catastrophe that had come before. There is a deep and hopeful lesson in this, one worth resting in as you drift toward sleep. It is that life is extraordinarily resilient, that no matter how great the catastrophe, life finds a way to recover, to rebuild, to fill the world again with abundance and diversity and beauty. The Silurian Sea is the proof of it, a world brought back from the edge of ruin and made more alive than ever. And having so completely conquered the water, life was about to do something even more extraordinary, something that would change the face of the planet forever. It was about to leave the water and begin the conquest of the land. Let us follow it now, to the very edge of the sea. We have explored the conquered sea, full of life at every level, from the reefs on the floor to the drifters in the open water. But the greatest drama of the Silurian, the thing that makes this period a true turning point in the history of the planet, was not happening in the depths of the sea at all. It was happening at the very edge of the water, in the shallow margins where the sea met the land, in the tidal flats and the estuaries and the damp shores. Because it was here, in these narrow, in-between places, that life was beginning to do something it had never done before. It was beginning to leave the water entirely and to colonize the empty land. For all of the history of complex life up to this point, the land had been almost entirely barren. Life had filled the seas, had conquered the water in all its richness and complexity, but the land above the waterline had remained a wasteland, a silent expanse of bare rock and drifting sand, without forests, without soil in the sense we would recognize, without the teeming life that filled the seas. The land was the great empty frontier, the one part of the world that life had not yet claimed. And there were good reasons for this, for the land was a hostile place for creatures adapted to the water. Out of the water, a creature faced the crushing pull of gravity, unbuffered by the buoyancy of the sea. It faced the danger of drying out, of losing the water its body needed to survive. It faced the difficulty of breathing air rather than water, of reproducing away from the sea, of moving across a solid surface. The land was a wall, and for a very long time life had remained on the water side of it. But the land was also an opportunity, and an enormous one. It was empty. It was full of sunlight, unfiltered by water. And it was, above all, free of the intense competition and predation that filled the crowded, conquered sea. In the sea, every niche was occupied, every role was filled, and the competition for space and food and safety was fierce, and the predators were everywhere. But on the land there was nothing. No competitors, no predators, only open space and sunlight and possibility. For any creature that could find a way to survive out of the water, the land offered a whole new world, empty and waiting to be claimed. And so, in the Silurian, driven perhaps by the very completeness with which life had conquered the sea, by the intense competition and crowding of the water, some living things began to make the crossing. They began, tentatively in the damp margins where sea met land, to venture out of the water to colonize the shore, to take the first steps in the conquest of the land. It was not a sudden thing, and it was not a deliberate thing, for life has no plan and no intention. It was the slow, gradual result of countless small adaptations, of creatures finding advantage in the damp margins, of life pressing outward into the one great empty space left in the world. but its significance was immense. Because the conquest of the land, which began in the Silurian, would eventually transform the entire face of the planet, would clothe the continents in green, would fill the air with life, and would eventually lead to every land plant and every land animal that has ever existed, including us. The first steps onto land are among the most important events in the history of life, and they were taken in the Silurian, at the edge of the conquered water. Two great pioneers led this conquest, and they came in a particular order. First came the plants, for the plants had to establish themselves on the land before the animals could follow, providing the food and the shelter, and the changed environment that would make animal life on land possible. And then came the animals, the first small creatures to leave the water and breathe the air. Let us meet these pioneers, beginning with the first green things to colonize the empty land. The conquest of the land began, as it had to, with the plants. Before any animal could make a permanent life out of the water, the land had to be made habitable, had to be greened, had to be given the beginnings of soil and food and shelter. And this great work was begun in the Silurian by the first true land plants, small and simple and humble pioneers that would nonetheless transform the world. For a long time before the Silurian, the land had not been entirely lifeless. There had been, most likely, films and crusts of simple life clinging to the damp surfaces, mats of algae and bacteria, and perhaps the earliest, simplest plant-like organisms, living in the moist margins where they would not dry out. But these were low, simple, ground-hugging things, unable to rise up or spread far, confined to the dampest places. The great step, the true beginning of the conquest of the land by plants, came with the evolution of a new kind of plant, one that could stand up, that could carry water within itself, that could begin to spread across the land and rise toward the sun. These were the first vascular plants, and they appeared in the Silurian. The most famous of these Silurian pioneers was a small plant called Cooksonia, and it is one of the most important plants in the history of the world, though you could have held it in the palm of your hand. Cooksonia was tiny, only a few centimeters tall and astonishingly simple. It had no leaves, no flowers, no roots in the way we would recognize. It was little more than a small, smooth green stem, forking as it rose, dividing into branches, and at the tips of those branches it bore small rounded structures, the sporangia, which held the spores by which it reproduced. That was all. A tiny, leafless, forking green stem, no taller than your finger, standing in the damp margin at the edge of the water. And yet this humble little plant, and others like it, represented one of the great revolutions in the history of life, the beginning of the greening of the land. What made Cooksonia and its relatives so significant was what they had solved. To live out of the water, a plant faces enormous challenges. It must not dry out, and so it needed a waterproof outer skin, and tiny pores that could open and close to let gases in and out while controlling the loss of water. It must stand up against gravity, and so it needed some internal support. And it must move water and nutrients through its body, from the damp ground up into its rising stem, and so it needed internal tissues, tiny tubes for conducting water, the beginnings of the vascular system that gives the vascular plants their name. Cooksonia had begun to solve these problems, and in solving them, it had found a way to rise up off the damp ground and stand in the open air, reaching toward the sunlight. It was small and it was simple, but it was a plant that could live on the land, and from such beginnings, everything that followed would grow. Across the Silurian, these first small land plants spread through the damp margins and the wetlands, greening the edges of the water, beginning to clothe the barren land in the first tentative growth. They were still small, still confined to the moist places, still nothing like the great forests that would come. But they were the pioneers, the first green things to establish a foothold on the empty land, and they were changing the world. As they grew and spread and died, they began to build the first soils. They began to alter the atmosphere, releasing oxygen, drawing in carbon dioxide. And they began to create habitats, places where other creatures might live, food that other creatures might eat. The first green things were making the land habitable, preparing the way for the animals that would follow. And follow they did, for in the Silurian, in the wake of the plants, the first animals also crept out of the water and onto the land. Let us meet these first pioneers of the animal conquest of the land. Once the plants had begun to green the damp margins of the land, the animals could follow, and in the Silurian they did. These first pioneers were small and they were humble, and they would have been easy to overlook, but they were the vanguard of one of the greatest movements in the history of life, the animal conquest of the land. They were the first creatures to leave the water permanently, to breathe the air, to make a life on the empty continents. And from them, in the fullness of time, would descend every land animal that has ever lived. The first animals to colonize the land were not the fish, and they were not the ancestors of the four-limbed creatures that would come much later. They were arthropods, the great group that includes the insects, the spiders, the crustaceans, and the many-legged creatures like the millipedes and centipedes. The arthropods were, in many ways, ideally suited to be the first pioneers of the land, for they already possessed some of the things that life on land requires. They had hard external skeletons, tough outer shells that could help protect their bodies from drying out and support them against the pull of gravity. They had jointed limbs that could carry them across a solid surface. And they were small, which made the challenges of life on land more manageable. And so it was the arthropods that led the way, creeping out of the water and onto the damp, newly greening shores. Among the very first known land animals is a small creature found in the Silurian rocks of Scotland, a tiny millipede that lived around this time, and is one of the oldest known creatures to have breathed air. It was small, unremarkable to look at, a little many-legged animal creeping through the damp vegetation at the edge of the water. But preserved in its fossil, as we understand it, are tiny openings called spiracles, the small holes through which air-breathing arthropods take in oxygen. And those spiracles are the sign of something momentous, for they mean that this little creature was breathing air, that it had made the crossing from water to land, that it was living, at least in part, out of the sea. It is among the oldest evidence we have of an animal breathing air on the land, a tiny pioneer of the great conquest, creeping through the first green margins of the Silurian world. Alongside these early millipedes came other arthropod pioneers. There were the earliest arachnids, the ancestors and relatives of the spiders and scorpions, small predators that hunted among the first land plants and the other small creatures colonizing the shore. There were various other small arthropods exploring the new frontier, finding food and shelter in the damp margins, taking advantage of the empty land. Together, these small creatures formed the first land animal communities, tiny ecosystems at the edge of the water, the first outposts of animal life on the barren continents. They were small and they were simple, but they were the beginning, the first animals to make the land their home. Life on land in the Silurian was still confined to the damp margins, to the moist places where the first plants grew and the first animals could avoid drying out. It was a narrow foothold, a thin fringe of life at the edge of the water, nothing like the rich terrestrial world that would come. But it was a beginning and a momentous one. For the first time in the history of the planet, there was life on the land, plants greening the shores and animals creeping among them, breathing the air, making a living out of the sea. The conquest of the land had begun, and it had begun because life had so completely conquered the water first, filling the sea to overflowing, driving some creatures to seek their fortune in the empty land beyond. The two conquests were linked, the conquest of the water leading to the conquest of the land, and both of them were unfolding together in the warm and living world of the Silurian. We have witnessed the two great triumphs of the Silurian, the complete conquest of the sea and the first steps onto the land. And now it is worth pausing to ask why these things happen when they did, and why they happen where they did, in the narrow margin between the water and the land. For there is a deep logic to it, a connection between the conquered sea and the newly colonized land, that reveals something profound about the way life spreads and grows. Consider first why life left the water at all. The sea was rich, warm, full of food, the cradle of all complex life. Why would any creature leave it for the harsh and hostile land where it faced drying out, and the crushing pull of gravity, and the difficulty of breathing air? The answer lies in part in the very success of life in the sea. Because life had conquered the water so completely, filling every niche, occupying every role, the sea had become a crowded and intensely competitive place. Everywhere a creature turned, there were competitors seeking the same food in the same space, and predators seeking to make a meal of it. The reefs were crowded. The seafloor was carpeted with life. The shallows were patrolled by fierce hunters. In such a crowded, dangerous, fully occupied sea, the pressure to find new opportunities, new places to live, was intense. And the one great empty space left in the world, the one place free of competitors and predators, was the land. The land, for all its hostility, offered something the crowded sea could not, which was opportunity without competition. The first plants to colonize the damp shores found sunlight and space, and no other plants to compete with. The first animals to creep onto the land found food, in the form of the spreading plants and the other early colonists, and no predators waiting for them, and no competitors already established. For a creature that could find a way to survive out of the water, the empty land was a world of open possibility, a frontier without rivals. And so, driven by the crowding of the conquered sea and drawn by the emptiness of the land, life pressed outward, across the great boundary, onto the shore. And consider why it happened in the margins, at the very edge of the water. The tidal flats and the estuaries and the damp shores were the perfect training ground for the conquest of the land, because they were neither fully sea nor fully land, but something in between. In these margins, a creature could venture partly out of the water while still remaining close to it, could begin to experience the air and the sunlight and the challenges of the land while still being able to retreat to the safety of the sea. The margins were a gradual slope from water to land, a place where the transition could be made in small steps, over countless generations, each small adaptation building on the last. A creature did not have to leap from the deep sea onto the dry continent in a single bound. It could creep slowly through the damp margins, adapting a little at a time, until at last its descendants could live on the land. The edge of the water was the doorway between the two worlds, and it was through this doorway that life made its great crossing. There is something deeply fitting in this, in the idea that the conquest of the land was born from the conquest of the sea, that the crowding and competition of the fully living ocean drove life outward onto the empty continents, and that the crossing was made gradually, through the in-between margins where the two worlds met. It reveals a pattern that runs through the whole history of life, the way that success in one place drives expansion into another, the way that life presses always outward into every available space, filling the world, claiming every frontier. The Silurian was the age when this pattern produced two of its greatest triumphs at once, the conquest of the water and the first conquest of the land, linked together, unfolding in the warm and living world at the edge of the ancient sea. And from these beginnings, the whole future of life on land would grow. But the Silurian itself was drawing toward its close, flowing onward into the age that would follow. Let us see how it ended and what it gave to the world. Every geological period comes to an end, giving way to the next, and the Silurian was no exception. But the end of the Silurian was not marked by a great catastrophe, not by a sudden mass extinction like the one that had ended the Ordovician before it. Instead, the Silurian flowed gently onward into the age that followed, the Devonian, carrying with it all the innovations and triumphs it had produced, and handing them on to a world that would take them to new heights. The Silurian ended not with a bang, but with a continuation, a passing of the torch to the next great chapter in the history of life. This is not to say that the Silurian seas were perfectly stable and untroubled, for they were not. Across the period, there were several episodes of disturbance, times when the chemistry and the temperature and the circulation of the oceans shifted, causing waves of stress and extinction among the creatures of the sea. Scientists have identified several such events within the Silurian, disturbances that struck particularly at certain groups, such as the graptolites and the conodonts, the tiny creatures whose fossils are so useful for reading the time of the period. These events show that the Silurian world was dynamic, that its seas were subject to change and upheaval, that even in this age of recovery and triumph, life faced ongoing challenges and periodic crises. The sea was conquered, but it was not entirely at peace. Still, none of these disturbances rose to the level of the great catastrophe that had come before, and through all of them, life continued, adapting and recovering and pressing on. As the Silurian gave way to the Devonian, the innovations of the Silurian were poised to flower into full dominance. The jawed fish, which had risen and diversified in the Silurian, would explode into an astonishing variety in the Devonian, which would come to be known as the Age of Fishes, when the seas would fill with fish of every kind, from armored giants to the ancestors of sharks and bony fish, and eventually, the creatures that would crawl onto the land. The land plants, which had made their first tentative foothold in the Silurian, would spread and grow and diversify in the Devonian, rising up into the first true forests, transforming the barren continents into green landscapes. And the land animals, which had crept out of the water in the Silurian as small arthropod pioneers, would multiply and spread, and eventually, in the Devonian, the first four-limbed vertebrates would make their own crossing onto the land, beginning the lineage that would lead to all the amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals to come. In this way, the Silurian was a crucial bridge, a foundational age, the period in which the seeds of so much of the future were planted. It was the age in which life recovered from catastrophe and conquered the water completely. It was the age in which the jaw arose and the fish began their rise. It was the age in which the first plants and the first animals colonized the land, and it handed all of these things on to the Devonian, and to the ages beyond, where they would grow into the full richness of the living world. The Silurian did not end in destruction, but in continuation, its triumphs flowing onward into the deep future of life. And that future, in a very real sense, includes us. For the fish that would become our ancestors, the plants that would clothe the world in green, the very jaws in our own heads, all trace their beginnings to the warm and living seas of the Silurian. The Silurian is gone now, more than 400 million years gone, a span of time so vast that the human mind cannot truly hold it. Its warm, shallow seas have drained away. Its reefs have been lifted up and turned to stone. Its great sea scorpions and its drifting graptolites and its first small land pioneers have long since vanished from the earth. And yet the Silurian is not truly gone, for it left behind an inheritance so profound that it shapes the living world to this very day, including the world that you live in and the very body in which you rest. Think of what the Silurian gave to the world. It gave the recovery from catastrophe, the proof that life can rebuild itself even after near annihilation, the demonstration of the extraordinary resilience of the living world. It gave the complete conquest of the sea, the filling of every zone and niche of the ocean with life, the reefs and the shelled multitudes and the hunters and the drifters, a fully living sea. It gave the jaw, that world-changing innovation, the hinged mouth that would allow the vertebrates to become active hunters and begin their long climb toward dominance. It gave the rise of the fish, the beginning of the age of vertebrates in the sea, the deep roots of the lineage that would eventually lead to us. And most momentously of all, it gave the first conquest of the land, the first green plants and the first small animals to leave the water and make a home on the empty continents, the beginning of all terrestrial life. Everything that followed, in a sense, grew from these Silurian beginnings. The great forests of the ages to come grew from the first small land plants of the Silurian. The vast diversity of land animals, the insects and the amphibians and the reptiles and the dinosaurs and the mammals, all descended, ultimately, from the first small pioneers that crept out of the Silurian water. The fish that fill the modern seas trace their rise to the Silurian dawn of the age of fishes. And you, resting here, breathing, thinking, are the distant descendant of the Silurian conquest. For the jaw in your head is a modified fish gill arch that arose in the Silurian seas, and your very existence traces back, through an unbroken chain of living things, to the small-jawed fish and the stubborn land pioneers of that ancient age. We know all of this, as much as we know it, because the Silurian wrote its story in the rocks, and because generations of scientists have learned to read that story. The reefs turned to limestone, packed with the fossils of the creatures that built them. The sea scorpions and the trilobites and the shells were buried and preserved. The graptolites left their faint writing on the dark shales, the timekeepers of the period. The first land plants and the first land animals left their delicate traces in the ancient rocks of Scotland and elsewhere. And from all of these fossils, painstakingly, across more than a century of discovery, we have reassembled the story of the Silurian, though never completely. For the record is always partial, and much must remain uncertain, only as we understand it. But what we understand is a story of triumph, of recovery and conquest and beginning, one of the great turning points in the long history of life. And now, as our journey through the Silurian seas comes to its close, let us rise one last time toward the surface and out of the deep past, and consider what it all means as we drift at last toward sleep. We have traveled far tonight, back across more than 400 million years, into the warm, shallow seas of the Silurian, and through their crowded and living waters and out to the very edge of the ancient world, where life first crept onto the empty land. And now, as our journey ends, let us float once more in that warm and gentle sea, and let the Silurian settle into something peaceful, a quiet beginning, resting in the deep past. Because the Silurian was, above all, a beginning. It was not the most dramatic of ages, not the most famous, not the most terrible. It produced no giant dinosaurs, no great catastrophes to rival the ones before and after it. It was, in many ways, a quiet age, a warm and gentle time of shallow seas and slow recovery. But it was in this quiet age that so much of the future was born. The conquest of the water was completed here. The jaw arose here. The fish began their rise here. And here, in the damp margins at the edge of the sea, life took its first steps onto the land, the beginning of everything that would one day fill the continents with green and with the movement of living things. The Silurian was the quiet beginning of the world we know. There is something deeply peaceful in this, in the image of the Silurian as a gentle age of beginnings, a warm, shallow sea in which life, having survived catastrophe, quietly rebuilt itself and reached out toward new worlds. There were no thunderous events, no world-shaking calamities, only the slow, patient, persistent spread of life, filling the sea, greening the shore, creeping onto the land. It was a time of recovery and of quiet triumph, of life doing what life always does, pressing outward into every available space, claiming every frontier, filling the world with more life. And from these gentle beginnings, everything else would grow. And there is a deep comfort, too, in the resilience the Silurian reveals, the way life recovered so completely from the great catastrophe that had come before. It reminds us that even the worst disasters are not the end, that life finds a way to rebuild, to recover, to flourish again, that the story of the living world is not, in the end, a story of destruction, but of persistence, of the stubborn refusal of life to be extinguished. The Silurian Sea, so full and so alive after the near emptying of the oceans, is the proof of it, and there is peace in that knowledge, a quiet reassurance that runs beneath the whole story of life on Earth. So let the Silurian become, now, something you can rest in, a warm and gentle sea in the deep past, full of the quiet beginnings of everything that would follow. Picture it if you like, one last time, the warm, shallow water catching the light, the reefs rising from the floor, the sea lilies swaying, the great sea scorpions gliding through the shallows, the first fish rising, and at the edge of the water, the first small green plants standing in the damp margins, and the first tiny pioneers creeping onto the empty land. A world at its beginning, a world full of promise, a world quietly, patiently becoming the world we know. The warm sea rocks gently beneath you. The light fades softly from the shallow water, gold to green to deep blue to black. The Silurian is far behind now, more than 400 million years behind, its warm seas long vanished, its creatures long turned to stone. But its inheritance flows on, through all the ages, into the living world of today and into you. And the ocean, the eternal ocean, the same water that once held the warm Silurian seas and holds all the seas of today, rolls on quietly under the stars, patient and deep and calm, carrying you now gently into rest. Sleep well.